start, before I introduce our panelists, let me start with a brief introduction on the project as a whole. As you would have seen from the invitation, we've entitled this event Ways of Knowing Atrocity. And I think that warrants some discussion on what we mean by ways of knowing and the project as a whole. So for the last 12 months, myself, Bryony Jones and Julia Beibach, who have been working and arranging a series of roundtable discussions and workshops that have happened between Bern, Oxford, London, Pristina and Kigali, where we have been looking at and discussing the different means through which transitional justice processes have been designed, implemented, and assessed. And so what I want to touch on today is actually 3 points that I think have emerged from these discussions. And the 3 points, the first is theoretical, the second is more practical, and the final one is ethical. And so let me start with this theoretical point. And for me, really, it was the theoretical question that first prompted the research project, which actually began as early as 2008, when at the time I was in Rwanda doing research, and I was looking at the interactions between the international, the national, and the local courts there, through doing interviews with the judges, lawyers, and researchers who were involved in that process. But as I was trying to look at how people were making sense of the justice process, what I was struck with was that it was a preliminary question of how people are making sense of the harm itself. Because it is the substance, the physical abuse that in many ways prompts the whole enterprise of transitional justice, whether it is for an advocacy or a research agenda. Because in some ways it is the incomprehensibility of these crimes, the incomprehensibility of the gas chamber, of the child struck with a machete, of a firing squad turned on civilians, that prompts people to try to find ways of containing that abuse. But it is in the means through which we describe that abuse itself that shapes what that abuse is. And so our theoretical concern was really, how do the different forms, whether they're legal forms, whether they are social scientific forms, whether it's forensic forms, how do the forms through which we know about serious human rights violations and make sense of those themselves shape what we understand those violations to be? And we drew very strongly on Gunther Elber's work on forms of knowledge here, where we looked at, so let me give you an example that comes out and is discussed specifically in the research manual, where you could provide an account of a harm through how it has been recognized in public international law as the basis for a reparation claim. So we can look at how harm is known through law to form as forming the basis for a reparation claim. And this can provide us with a very useful platform when looking at how future reparations claims come before the International Criminal Court. But this way of knowing is strikingly different to how that same abuse may be understood through local accounts of that abuse or through rumors of the occurrence of that, whether it is a murder or a massacre. And those particular rumors, that particular way of knowing, is very much shaped by the possibly immediate political circumstance or by a longer social history where that particular abuse might be interpreted. And so what we were interested in looking at was in putting side by side different accounts, literary, legal, psychological accounts of abuse. We might be able to start to tease out how the forms through which we know that abuse actually shapes the abuse, our understanding of it itself. And so then the second point and concern that I think has emerged has really centered on a more practical concern. Because I think transitional justice and this area that many of us are familiar with itself is interdisciplinary by its very nature. And so what we were able to do in this knowledge exchange was bring together a range of different disciplines, from political science to psychology to law to literary studies to sociology, to start to have an exchange across those approaches and those divides. And what we started to see was how innovative and different methodologies can show us something quite different about the abuse. And it's those different examples that form the basis for the examples that are then mentioned in the Transitional Justice Manual, which we're very excited to be launching today. And so we'll see some of the differences between using statistical tools to estimate conflict deaths in Syria versus innovative ethnographic approaches where you're using life histories alongside, combined with survey work to start to look at how justice processes have been understood. Seen against literary accounts of, for example, Anki Cross work, which we discuss on forgiveness in post-apartheid South Africa, where a detailed translation actually provides our first route through which we might then be able to access the particular worldview of the people who have been subject to the human rights abuse. And then finally, I think what emerged was the third point of an ethical concern. Because I think in transitional justice research and advocacy, we spent a lot of time talking about post-conflict places, about victims and perpetrators, about the experience of abuse. But the majority of both scholarship and NGO work is still written outside looking in. And so we are left with some tensions about what are the implications of conducting this work, whether we're doing, regardless of the standpoint we're starting from this outside looking in. And we were very conscious of this in drafting and working on the Transitional Justice Manual. So the manual brings together these range of discussions that we had in these various locations, and we then drew together the different methodologies that were used, and it was written by a number of graduate students, in collaboration with a number of graduate students involved in Oxford Transitional Justice Research at the University of Oxford and students at King's College London. And then we drew an initial draft that came from the exchange happening in London and Oxford, and we took that draft to Kigali and Rwanda and Pristina and Kosovo for a series of workshops, where we then discussed the manual about how it might be used, and about responses to it, and about the process of doing research inside and coming from the particular context. And so what results and what we're going to be launching today is not really a how-to guide for doing transitional justice research, but rather it offers a way of thinking through the process of conducting that research. Because I think that one of the foundational points that when it comes to whether you're doing work for an advocacy agenda or you're doing work for an academic audience, is critically thinking about the process through which we move through the activity, and also understanding that a critical and robust approach is in many ways one of the things that I think is common to the various types of work, that is common and necessary to the various types of work that are happening in the field of transitional justice today. And so it's this common need, really, to bring together people involved in civil society and in academia, and to discuss what these forms are, that has really prompted the coming together and being in conversation today. And so it's with those two things of a practical, a theoretical, and an ethical framework that I would really like us to start to explore the links between academic and advocacy research. And I'm very pleased to be able to do that with the three panelists that we have on the stage today. So first let me start on that side and introduce Roger Duthie. Roger has joined us from New York, where he's a senior associate at the International Center for Transitional Justice, a senior research associate. And Roger's work has looked at the nexus between transitional justice and forced displacement and socioeconomic development and transitional justice. And his most recent publication is an edited collection looking at that topic. And next we have Mina Rauschenbach, who we're very, very happy to be welcoming back to this knowledge exchange, where Mina is now a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Leuven in Belgium. She's also one of the contributors to the knowledge exchange overall, and we discuss some of her work in the Methods Manual. And Mina's been doing fantastic collaborative work looking at how individuals who have been indicted by international criminal tribunals have experienced and made sense of the justice process. So shifting the focus onto the perpetrator's view of the justice process and the implications of that for the legitimacy of international criminal law. And then finally, but certainly not least, we're very happy to have Pierre Hazan with us, who's a current consultant at the Hirondale Foundation. He's also a professor at the Center of Education and Research in Humanitarian Action in Geneva. So he hasn't had to come as far, but he's been to London and spent some time with us there as well. So we're very happy to have you here. And as you can see across our panelists, what we bring together here is people who are involved both in the research and academic face of transitional justice, but also have views and angles on civil society and experience in that regard. So I hope that gives you some background on where we've come in order to be here today. And I do want to thank, and I've really enjoyed collaborating with SwissPeace on this project. But you've heard a lot from me now. Luckily, you'll hear less going forward as we open up for the discussion. So just to get us started, let me start with Roger. Perhaps we could. I was interested in what your reflections were and what your entry point into working on transitional justice has been.
Sure, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I think it's a great publication, and it definitely brings up lots of interesting issues for us to talk about today. My entry point is that I work for an international NGO, ICTJ, which works on transitional justice and generally tries to provide technical assistance and knowledge to countries, government institutions, and civil society groups that are trying to design and implement transitional justice processes. So I work in the research unit there, so I'm really at the intersection of this academic and advocacy and civil society connection. And so, we, in terms of entry point into the research that we do, as a unit, we sort of come at or select research topics from a number of different motivations. One would be gaps in the transitional justice literature itself, which would be similar to what the other academics might come at it. But we also respond to gaps within the knowledge of ICTJ, the organization, and its different country offices. Very often, the displacement project that you mentioned is an example of a topic where people working in different countries for ICTJ suggested to us that they often work in contexts where transitional justice doesn't necessarily deal with displacement directly, but it is a problem where they would benefit from some guidance because of all the overlaps between issues of forced displacement and issues of human rights abuses and justice. So that's a second way that angle that we come at. And a third would be that I think this is part of the nature of the field of transitional justice itself is still fairly, to me, it seems fairly young, even though it's a couple of decades now. But there's still a lot of debate about what the definition of transitional justice is and what are the boundaries between transitional justice and other fields. And so this has sort of prompted a number of the projects that I've worked on, which have looked at transitional justice and displacement, and transitional justice and development, transitional justice and demobilization programs, and transitional justice in education. So we're always trying to look at the intersection between fields and where the boundaries are with transitional justice, where transitional justice can make a contribution to other areas. I don't want to go on too long, but I have another point. If that's
Please, yeah.
So we can come back to the issue of sort of working for an advocacy organization, because I think it is very interesting to be at that intersection. But I think that obviously ICTJ as an organization has its agendas and has the work that it's trying to push forward. And as a research unit within the organization, we're fairly independent in terms of the topics that we end up working on and the research that we do and the conclusions that we draw. But one of the issues that's raised in the publication is in terms of entry points, this idea of defining key terms and concepts. And I think that while we're very independent as a unit, we do begin our research generally using the definition or the understandings of, say, transitional justice and reconciliation that ICTJ has. And I think we as an organization have an understanding of transitional justice that is fairly narrow compared to some other definitions of the term. And it focuses very much on a set of specific measures, so prosecutions, truth-telling, reparations, rather than some other approaches which may be a bit broader, focus less on measures, and may include different types of injustice. So I think there's a little bit of back and forth there between the research unit and the organization. And it's not just in one direction, because the work that we do on certain topics, such as vetting and institutional reform, has also very much informed the way that the organization ends up understanding those issues and those notions.
Great, Roger. Yeah, what was it that brought you into the field of transitional justice?
Oh, it's very simple. It was specific events. For me, I can even give you a day. The 12th of December 1992. It was in Geneva, in the UN building, and in one room we had, according to Security Council resolution, people thinking how to induct war criminals in former Yugoslavia. And it was a small room, not very nice. And then there was a huge room with a lot of flowers and the red carpets. And in that big room, there was a lot of people you may know, Karadzic, Mladic, nice guys. And it was a peace conference in Geneva on former Yugoslavia. And I asked myself, like many people, very simple questions. What's the interactions between peace and justice? And it's maybe hard to remember, to recall that time, 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, but it was very strange. Actually, the lawyers were looked at almost marginal elements of a much more important discussion, conversation on peace. And I was wondering, what is the meaning of this embryo of a future tribunal? Does it have any meaning? Was it purely an alibi of bad consciousness of Western public opinion? Does it mean more? Can it have some level of independence? What is it going to achieve? Is this hopefully one day existing tribunal will it be successful? And how is it possible in the same time to achieve some kind of peace with Milosevic and Karadzic and Mladic and Tuchman and Izetbegovic? So that was the first question. And I was based in Geneva, but also I was covering the war as a journalist in former Yugoslavia. So I could see, and I was going very often to New York. So I could see the triangulation between New York, the Security Council, then Geneva, the whole process of establishing the tribunal, and then the reality on the ground. And I became more and more interested by this, by the gap happening between the local realities and the so-called new transitional justice institutions. And then, it was terrible years. In 95 or 94, as we all know, there was the genocide in Rwanda. And I was sent to cover the genocide, at the end of the genocide. And asked myself a very simple question. How are these people going to live among them when it is over? And as you all know, the Security Council Resolution 955 was adopted in November 94. And the resolution was speaking about establishing the ICTR, the International Tribunal. And only one country, as you may recall, opposed the establishment of the tribunal, which was Rwanda. So there was a very interesting political discussion about the value of this tribunal, which was opposed by the government, which was created as a result of a genocide. And I was also puzzled by the definition of a mandate and the whole question of the definition of a mandate and how this mandate compared to the other mandate of the ICTY. Why the ICTY was open-ended and the other was not open-ended. And so I became more and more interested in not so much in the process of reconciliation, but what we understand by the process of reconciliation. What does it mean? What are the values of these tools? Are they effective? Are they just, what kind of political goal are they pursuing? What are they achieving? So that was the beginning of my long journey in this strange world.
And I think that this point around the potential, the role of civil society and the role of academic research in responding to gaps in practice is an interesting one. Roger, how do you think that ICTJ, what the role of civil society is when we're looking at the practical implementation of these responses to serious human rights violations, and then the challenge around some of the challenges around how those processes are implemented?
I think that ideally civil society is in each context will be a very important driver of transitional justice processes. For a number of different reasons that you don't want everything to be a top-down process. Civil society ideally would do a good job of presenting the viewpoints of different groups, including victims. But I think in reality, there are a number of different dynamics that happen in terms of civil society's role. One interesting one is that in many contexts, civil society may not be quite as organized or quite as strong as you would like it to be. So its role might be more limited than you would like. In many contexts, civil society is just as other more formal state institutions are are weakened or harmed or discredited because of what happens during a conflict or of repression. We're beginning a research project right now at ICTJ, which is generally looking at transitional justice in different contexts. And part of what it's trying to look at is how does this different context in terms of institutions being weaker, including civil society, being weaker than in other contexts. How does that affect what you can do and what ends up happening? But at the same time, I think a number of country examples have shown that by participating in transitional justice processes, there can be this, to some extent, a sort of catalyzing effect where the organizations or the actors from civil society who engage in the process can be strengthened by it. They can, go on to play a very important role later in the process. They can also develop during a transitional justice process and then take on a different role, whether it's focusing on justice more broadly or human rights more broadly, or development in a post-transitional situation. So I think there's a lot of things that can happen in terms of civil society's role in these processes. And I think from a research perspective, it's really, really important for us to try and understand those.
Okay. Let's bring Mina into the discussion here. Perhaps let's start with the same question there. What was it that really prompted you as a young academic to pursue a particular research project focusing on a particular transitional justice mechanism?
Well, to start with it, I was actually working in Geneva on a project about victims. It was in 2005. And it was about their participation in the criminal justice system. Do they have a position? Is this position increased in the Swiss criminal justice system? And at that point, the ICC was starting to work. And there was this whole issue of participation of victims in the ICC, first time. And then I looked into the ICTY, and ICTY victims were not participating, they were just used as witnesses. Started wondering about this international criminal justice system, and started thinking, I thought, okay, we're working on victims, and there's a lot of work being done on victims, but what about the perpetrators? Because this new international criminal justice system is based on one important premise, bringing back peace, deterrence, trying to restore moral order. And I thought, deterrence, okay, now we're in 95, I was thinking back in 95, the ICTY was already working, and we have Srebrenica, so where is deterrence? So a colleague of mine and I, we started thinking about these perpetrators, and we said, we should really try to talk to these perpetrators, to these people who've been accused by the international criminal justice system. And we thought, this is a crazy idea. We're never going to be able to do it. But we built up a project and got the funding. And that was like, we just didn't think we were going to get it. And the idea of that project was to go and interview people who had been accused by the ICTY, whether convicted or acquitted. And of course, after their passage, through the whole justice system, because we couldn't access anybody who was in detention at The Hague during the trial. We had to wait for the finish of the trial. And so we interviewed about 18 people, some in prison, some out of prison already, some acquitted, like three people who were acquitted, people who were high level, mid-level, and also perpetrators, actual perpetrators. It's a research project that lasted 2 years, and well, comforted us in a certain number of our assumptions. The first thing for us that really came out of this was that denial of responsibility is kind of common and salient and clear. The only ones who do accept part of responsibility are the ones who actually perpetrated physically a crime, the ones who killed, the ones who raped. This denial of responsibility is, I would say, as I'm a social psychologist and a criminologist, so the first thing I would say is, okay, it's normal to deny responsibility for an offender. A normal, ordinary offender would deny it too. But in addition to this propensity and this personal motivation to deny responsibility, there is also the fact that the legal apparatus, which has served to attribute responsibility, is not quite very solid. Let's put it that way. Decisions are very often based on descriptions or attributions of responsibility which are novel, which are, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to go into technical details, but let's say that the whole jurisprudence has evolved very much in ICTY to get to levels of attribution of responsibility where the level of mens rea, the level of awareness, of intent, is reduced to negligence, basically. So kind of shaky premises, shaky foundations for these for many of these convictions, and of course these accused persons know about this, and it serves their stance of denial. So that was the first entry point. But then now I'm working on survey data that was collected in Bosnia and Serbia, doing that in KU Leuven in Belgium. And here the idea is this data was collected with about 850 respondents. It covers various transitional justice measures. So we asked them, do you think that it is important to establish the role and the responsibility of political institutions, of individuals? Do you think it's important to, for the harm that you suffered, to have this form or that form of reparation, for example, physical, financial compensation, or community work, and so on. So we looked at different aspects. These different aspects is accountability, truth, and reparation, and the different forms of these different these dimensions, transitional justice dimensions. Looking at relationships, how is accountability related to truth in a vision of possibility of reconciliation? Testing a model, it's kind of a complicated thing, but it's basically a statistical device which is called structural equation modeling techniques, where you look at these relationships and you try to establish a model. So this is what I'm doing now. Why am I doing it? I think I'm at a point where transitional justice researchers are, where we're all very critical. We're no more in this idea that, oh, transitional justice is so good. Truth is really important. Accountability is really important. We need trials. We need amnesties. We're at a point where we realize that there's been a lot of things that have been said theoretically, but not much has been really assessed. and this is the moment to assess it and assess it on the ground, local needs. What does it mean, reconciliation? Does reconciliation even have a meaning? I'm taking the example of Bosnia. More and more, I think that reconciliation is not the word to use. It's not the word to use. It's probably more coexistence, restoring trust, and maybe one day reconciliation. So I think we as practitioners have to be very careful about what we think we are evaluating, what we think we're assessing it, what we think we are assessing. Sorry, is it what we're really assessing, or is it an indicator of what we would like to assess? For example, reconciliation. Very often we assess other things than reconciliation. We assess trust, for example, which is maybe an element of reconciliation, but it's not reconciliation. So yeah, I think it's really, this is the critical moment where we are now in transitional justice.
I think what strikes me is how the entry point into working and researching transitional justice has, to a large extent, a certain common among the three of you, been about observing the practice of it. But now we've seen this, as Mina articulates, this critical turn where from observing the practice of it, there is increasing scholarship that is critical of how those processes are playing out and what the impact of those might be. And that, in some respects, takes us back to saying, well, what are the objectives that are driving these processes in the first place, and how are those objectives being understood? And this, I think, prompts us to say, well, what are the means through which, what are the methods that we use to start to examine what is the increasing level of practice in transitional justice? And also, what are the epistemologies, what are the methodologies that underpin a particular way of approaching it? What are the underlying ideas and assumptions that lead us into how we then look at these mechanisms and how we then analyze them? So maybe let me turn to Pierre here. In addition to your work as a journalist, you've also published in the academic sphere, and I'm thinking particularly about your edited collection on localizing transitional justice that you co-published with Lars Waldorf. When reflecting on a particular project, could you think of some examples where you've reflected specifically on the type of method that you were going to use, and also on the underlying epistemologies and theories that underpin the particular approach used?
I would like maybe to be very concrete and to take two very specific and very different examples. So, Mina rightly mentioned the word truth, and we all know how complicated it is to describe truth, and we know that some people would divide factual truth from subjective truth, from social truth, from dialogical truth, and so on. But the first example I would use is Racak. It's a massacre which happened on 16th of January 1999 in Kosovo. And I was there actually very quickly when it happened. And the question for me was, what is truth? And it was extremely difficult because in traditional justice we are all trying, we have 4 pillars, and there is one of them, the pillar of truth. But suddenly when you are in an event, you see what's happening, the events are still unfolding, the fighting is still going on, and you need yourself to assess what is truth. And at the same time, it was the first time ever that an international prosecutor at the time from the ICTY was going to a field, almost like a policeman when a crime happened. So it was for me it was fascinating, and I could see in the few minutes unfolding the discovery of a massacre that we had 4 propaganda machineries working simultaneously. We had, and 4 totally different narratives. You had the KLA narrative saying basically the Serbs killed a number of people who were totally innocent, including a lot of children. You had the opposite views of the Serb of Belgrade saying basically it's the crimes has been done by the KLA in order to prompt a NATO intervention. And you had the NATO view, which was, and the American view, I would say, more than NATO. The American view was to say that Milosevic was behind the massacre, and it was necessary to bomb and to start a NATO intervention. And you had the French view, and the French diplomats and the American diplomats were on the ground, was saying, well, the Americans are just trying to distort some events in order to intervene in Kosovo. For me, the description and the factual description of what happened was extremely complicated, and I was there on the ground when it happened. So years later, when we try to reconstruct events, it's even more complicated, because there are other parameters, proofs are not there, and so on. So what was also very interesting for me was to understand that the narrative which was being written at the time could prompt or not prompt a NATO intervention. If it was a crime, then there would be a NATO intervention. If it was an hoax done by VOCK, maybe there won't be any military intervention. So you could see how political events and factual events are linked and can have global consequences. That's one, just wanted to illustrate how difficult it is when we say truth is important. What is it? What are we talking about? What kind of truth? Are we able to construct some kind of truth? And the other, and I would like to mention another, and my point also here is that the observer is not only an observer, is directly impacting on the reality and changing the reality. The second point I would like to show, and maybe it's just 1 minute film if it's possible. Maybe I just a sec, please. I just would like to explain what it is. It's in, I've done a film 10 years ago in Chad. And there was one person who was the president of the Association of the Victims in Chad at the time, who wanted to be in this documentary. And for some reason, I didn't like that person. And I didn't want him to be in the film. And he wanted absolutely, and so I asked him something very specific. I said, you have been tortured in a very famous place at the headquarters of the special police, and if you can give me access to that, you'll be interviewed there. And I was quite confident it was impossible to go there. What I didn't know, but the president was his cousin. So the next day, he came to me with the authorization. And this authorization will lead to the images we are going to see. So that's the former headquarters of the police, the famous DDS. So it was a building which was protected by the military, and no one could enter for more than 10 years. So you may, some of you may recognize Red Brody and Olivier Berco, who was working on this Enabre case. And suddenly, what are we seeing? We are walking, and you will see the images, all the papers you see there, at the archives of DDS, of the police. And the whole case actually was basically built because we had access to this building. And one of the first sheet of paper we took was a letter of from the Chadian government thanking the CIA for training interrogateur. And Reed Brody is basically saying it's like heaven. He's in heaven now. And you see he has a small bag and he's trying to put some papers already in it. You will see that in a minute. So, and so that's, and as you all know, the Senabre case now is going on slowly, but it has, in last February, the case has been opened officially in Dakar, and the main documents are just the ones you have just seen here. Thank you. So just to make the point that what you do can change reality.
And the different ways through which we know about atrocity, whether it's recorded papers on the bottom of in an office, or then through a trial process many years later. Fascinating.
And that maybe the trial process wouldn't have happened without that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the other thing that strikes me is the relational aspect of both the practice and research of transitional justice. It's about the negotiation that lets you into the house or get someone in particularly to talk to you in a particular way that starts to open up both the avenues for knowing about the past, but also for understanding how the justice processes are responding to that past. Yeah. Great. Roger, let me turn to you now and ask for your reflections on a particular research project and how you made particular choices around what method to use and whether those choices were underpinned by a particular methodology.
So the projects that we do, we tend to take a similar approach, not entirely the same, but similar to in each one, and we generally structure them around trying to do a series of case or regional studies. So we have our broad topic, and we try to do a series of case studies, which tend to be fairly empirical, but qualitative, not quantitative stuff, but trying to tell us what has happened on a particular topic in a series of countries. And then we move on usually to, from that we choose a series of particular thematic issues that we want to then commission an additional series of studies on those, and those tend to be a bit more normative in terms of suggesting what should happen. But the topic itself for each project definitely can shape the way that we structure a project. And a good example would be the displacement project, because on previous projects we had looked at particular issues, particular transitional justice measures like reparations programs or like vetting processes. And there it's fairly easy or easier to find a set of researchers to investigate in a particular country or to write about a particular topic. But with a project like displacement, where you're really looking at the intersection between fields, it's very difficult to come at it from with the expertise that you have in transitional justice, not in the other areas. But it's also very difficult to find the right person for each country or for each topic, because it's difficult to find somebody who has expertise in transitional justice and in displacement. So what we've begun to do since then is structure organized projects around particular clusters rather than individuals or pairs of individuals. So we may pick a topic like prosecutions or reparations and displacement, and then get people to write sort of empirical pieces based on their practice, their work, but have somebody in each cluster, say, have somebody who is an expert in humanitarian assistance, have somebody who's an expert in development work in displacement context, have somebody who comes at it from the security perspective and somebody from the justice perspective, and then have them, as the process goes on, have them discuss writing their studies as they discuss with the others. So you're really trying to bring in different perspectives, and we found that that's difficult to do. It's difficult there's a number of challenges in doing that, but I think it works for those types of topics. It works better than trying to find a series of individual researchers. And we also, for a topic like displacement, we, again, coming from the fact that we don't have much expertise on a topic like displacement, we partnered with another organization that did right from the beginning. So it, again, the nature of the research tends to make something much more collaborative at different levels than it would be with a narrower topic.
And then how does that research that's being done then feed into the actual practice of the International Center for Transitional Justice as it consults with a particular government or a particular group about pursuing a particular transitional justice mechanism?
Well, the research is always meant to be useful to ICTJ. It's not meant to sort of back up positions that ICTJ takes, but it's meant to be useful for practitioners who work with ICTJ. It's also meant to be useful to policymakers, practitioners more broadly. So a lot of that comes down to how we sort of package or present the results of the research. We often publish our different studies, either publish them on the internet, on the website as a series of downloadable papers, or in an edited volume. But if we want to make it useful for practitioners, whether they're in ICTJ or not, we really need to distill the findings of the research into a guidance document or a set of policy recommendations, use the internet and the website to do podcasts, and really try and disseminate the research through events like this. Really sort of reach out to different target audiences. And I think that, again, the nature of the topic also can, in some ways, shape how you can do that. Some projects are much more specific, and you can come up with a set of fairly specific guidelines on how to implement vetting processes. But on a project like Transitional Justice and Development, which is another one of those ones that looks at the intersection of two fields, development is such a broad field, and we looked at so many different topics within that, like natural resources and land and issues of poverty, and civil society and social capital. It's a little difficult at the end of the day to sort of distill that down into a set of recommendations for practitioners. So in that way, again, the topic can shape what you can do, how much you can make it relevant.
Okay, thanks. And Mina, we've talked a little bit about, and you mentioned in your previous comments, the different methods that you've been using in terms of qualitative interviewing or statistical analysis or quantitative statistical analysis. But let's shift in terms of the experience, the process of undertaking that research, the process of undertaking those interviews or collecting the survey data itself. What do you see now going forward as some of the major ethical challenges that face doing this type of research and gathering data on these types of abuses?
well, I would say they're different depending on the research I would be referring to. But for the first research, the one on the accused, for us the first ethical issue we had was, okay, we're going to listen to people who are motivated to basically tell us their version of the story, to make us, persuade us, convince us that their story is the right story. So there's an issue of power. But at the same time, we as interviewers are also in a stance of power, because we are giving them the possibility to express themselves. So the first thing we were wondering is, will they accept to talk? Will they accept to talk? Will they want to talk about what they lived? Because there is one part you would say, okay, they would want to talk because it's a way for them to have a voice, it's a way for them to express their dissatisfaction, it gives them power. But at the same time, we as researchers can do what we want with what they say. So I think it was very important to stick to what they said, whether we liked it or not, to not get into, to listen to what they said without, as much as possible, without judging it, which was a difficult exercise. I think it's, I mean, having interviewed, I've interviewed a lot of victims in the past who told us a lot of really heart-wrenching and horrible stuff, and it was very difficult to hear. But I was, as a researcher, actually more affected by what I heard from the accused side. And that is pretty, it raises an ethical problem, because you have to make sure that you're not going to, it's not going to cloud your interpretation of what they say. And at the same time, you have to be very aware of your position, very aware of your feelings. And my colleague and me, we had kind of debriefing sessions after an interview to kind of get out what we felt. I mean, just to give you an example, we had one interview where a person described quite graphically what he had committed, which was rape and murder. And then at the end he said, but you know what, if I had to do it again, I would do it again. And we came out of this interview, we were very troubled, both of us, because we were actually, at that very moment when he said it, we were actually thinking, yes, that's what we wanted to hear. Because you're in your interview, and you're how do you say, you're penetrated in a story, and you're going further, and then you have like your boxes that you're ticking. And then we looked at each other and we felt horrible, because it was, and I'm sure as a journalist you experience the same thing. Well, that was the first thing. Second issue in terms of ethics is that, well, in our case there's the issue of there's a problem of confidentiality, and because all the informations we heard and we transcribed afterwards was, of course, can only be heard and read by my colleague and I. In our research, we don't use the whole. We don't use, how would I say, big parts of discourse. We use small parts of discourse, because otherwise you could identify these people, because there are not that many accused, and the stories are not always the same. And even though we try to, as much as possible, avoid transcribing details such as places, such as names, such as dates, and so on. It's pretty easy if you read the interview to know who is who. So, and this is a duty that is, I mean, confidentiality is important in any cases, whether it's a victim or a perpetrator. But in this case, it can also have legal consequences. So that was a very big ethical issue for us. And you know, gaining trust, basically, because it's such sensitive information. Gaining trust with lawyers, gaining trust with the accused was a lengthy process, and but yeah, it was very important to do it that way.
Fascinating. Pierre, maybe I'll go to you now and ask a similar question. What do you see as some of the major ethical challenges?
Well, first of all, I think we have a considerable problem with transitional justice terminology, because it was coined in the early 90s when there was a clear sense where history was going. And today we know that history is going in many, many different places and sometimes going backwards. So that's one thing we need to be aware of. Obviously for me, the question is quite simple. It's politicization. In tomorrow, we'll have the trial of the STL Special Tribunal of Lebanon opening. And if you look at the mandate, I'm feeling personally very uncomfortable. There is one person who used to be a prime minister but was not a prime minister when he was assassinated. And then you have the establishment of a special court when more than 100,000 people just died, including by chemical weapon in the next country. So, what are we talking about? The entire budget of the STL is much more important than the total budget of the Justice Ministry of Lebanon. At one point, I mean, enough is enough. There is a question, transitional justice has to be legitimate and to be credible for most of the beneficiaries. If it doesn't hold to that standard, then we have a problem. Well, we maybe not we, but some people do have a problem. And the level of politicization is, as we all know, very important. I think a number of us may share the views that the Gotovina process in the ICTY was not quite a fair ruling, or Aridina, to take another example. Or we can think about the ICTR and to realize that the second mandate was not fulfilled. Or we can take other examples. And what is true in international criminal justice is to a certain extent true also with other transitional justice mechanisms. And so we can think about truth commissions and see how some commissioners of truth commissions have been chosen, what's the balance between different commissioners, what their ideological affiliation, and on what basis they have been selected. When we can look at the mandate of some truth commissions, we can see that some of them were disbanded before they published any reports, and so on and so on. So I think, on the one hand, we have great tools which do exist, and I think that's a huge progress. And in the same time, we need to be very skeptical or very cautious about the way these tools are being used. And the difficulty today is the conversation is being extremely polarized. On the one hand, you have the people for ideological reasons are very much against international justice or traditional justice tools, and on the other hand you have people who are very strongly either the NGOs or the courts or the truth commissions who have also their, if I may say so, their outreach communication unit or a propaganda machine. And there is a huge vacuum in the middle, and there is no, from my perspective, there is little work which being done by media, and for simple reasons, because it's very expensive to cover courts or truth commissions or other transitional justice tools. And this vacuum is very worrying, because otherwise it will be filled by one side or the other side, and it will help to further delegitimize transitional justice tools.
Great. And Roger, let's hear from you. What do you see as the major ethical concerns facing the future of research and practice in this field?
From a sort of my point of view, working for ICTJ, I mean, we have some certain ethical challenges that come from the fact that we're very often commissioning work, research on on particular countries, very often by researchers from those countries. So, and I think there's a certain sort of ethical obligation involved in that relationship, in terms of trying to support those in-country researchers, in trying to disseminate the results or share the results of the research back with those researchers and with the communities in those countries that are being written about. There are also specific challenges in terms of, particularly in contexts where conflict is still ongoing, and where political transitions to democracy may not be complete, to say the least, where researchers to me have sometimes expressed concern about what they feel they can write about a specific government or about a specific actor, because it may create real sort of risk for them. And so there's a challenge on our side of things about not wanting somebody to put themselves in any sort of risk, but then thinking about what do you do with research that comes out of a process such as that, where you have to acknowledge the limitations of that research. At the larger, sort of broader perspective, as similar to what Pierre was saying, I think there are ethical, and again, I come at it from the research perspective. I think there are challenges in terms of our expectations of what transitional justice measures can do. And we talked a little bit about the time for assessing what transitional justice measures can do, and I think it's very important for researchers and for organizations advocating for transitional justice to engage in this discussion about the impact of measures. And I think you see a lot more work, a lot more empirical and quantitative work about some of the impact that's happening. But I also think that there's a bit of a challenge in terms of keeping in mind the limitations, both in terms of what that research can do. There are many social science fields where it's very difficult to empirically show, clearly what the impact of certain policy interventions. So I think we have to be. I think transitional justice is a field where you have to be particularly cautious in terms of claiming what impact you've had. I think there is some tendency in the field as well to expand our ideas or our expectations of what transitional justice measures can do in terms of the different types of injustices
note, what I'd like to do now for the last sort of 15 minutes of this discussion before we move to some champagne and some snacks. So that's a good motivation for prosecco. Sorry, and stuff.
You don't raise it.
Yeah, so raised and then moderated instantly.
Yes, there's a last project budget.
Yeah. I'd like to open it up for broader discussion, for questions, but also for reflections from the room. Who's going to be brave enough to start us off? Julia? Yeah.
So thank you again, all of you, for coming. We're really delighted to have you here today. Since we have labeled it as advocacy and academic research, I was wondering if you could elaborate some more on the differences you see in particular with regard to the ethical considerations. So in how far does the different background for your research, and I guess also the entry point, because I think academic research and advocacy research are really different entry points into the work. So how does that shape or influence ethical concerns you have in the work, and where are the major differences you see there?
Good. So maybe I'll get a brief response from the three of you.
First.
I'm not quite sure I totally understood the question in the sense.
Okay, maybe an example. The whole idea actually is part of or especially comes from the Kosovo workshop we had. And one important thing during that workshop or that came up was actually that there's a big difference between academic research and advocacy. And in Kosovo, the transitional justice process is kind of really in the beginning, starting. And it was much more for the civil society organizations, for the NGOs who were doing research on transitional justice. It was much more about advocacy and lobbying for survivors and victims' rights, and to raise awareness of what actually happened. And there was much about kind of data collection to generate or produce knowledge on what actually happened, like what atrocity happened. And I mean, in comparison to the Kigali workshop we had in summer, it was very different, because in Kigali or in Rwanda, the transitional justice process is about to come to hold, and we actually have quite big knowledge on what happened in Rwanda. So there was a big difference between those countries and the research undertaken. So I don't know if that makes anything clearer now, but if I see advocacy research and academic research and the ethical issues, I would see ethical issues that are kind of similar for at least one aspect, but I think there's several. The first aspect for me is that whether you're an NGO or a researcher from a university, you have to be very careful, one, of not raising expectations through your research, and two, to use the data in a sensitive manner. To use the data, how could I say this? Like in a way that reflects what the person who gave you the data wanted to express. Researchers and advocacy people, I think one thing they have to really keep in mind always is that when you're talking to somebody and that person is giving you information, is making a testimony, is answering a survey or whatever, they're giving you something that is precious for them, and also which is very very harmful, not harmful, but traumatizing. And even a perpetrator, for a perpetrator, this is something very very precious for them. And you really have to make sure you're not just using it like a witness in a trial. So this is, I think, an ethical issue that would be in both cases with the raising of expectations.
issue. Really, really important.
Well,
I don't know if I...
No, I would agree with Mina. There is the issue of the danger of instrumentalization by all sides, and that's a very serious issue. And obviously, but it's obvious. I don't know. It's worth mentioning. It's NGOs also, particular local NGOs, but also international NGOs have a shared interests. Which is a bit different from an academy perspective, and obviously that has also implications, concrete implications about the results and how the results are being framed.
Good, I can see a few hands, so maybe I'll get a couple of comments and questions. For all of our benefit, if you could just introduce yourself before asking the questions, so we get to know each other in the room.
I'm Rina Larue from swisspeace. I just had another question related to the ethics. I myself has also been looking at sort of ethics of research within conflict-affected contexts, not specifically in transitional justice forums, but in conflict-affected contexts. And what I found quite interesting is the lack of research or acknowledgement that has been done on our ethical practices. I mean, we all have to deal with it on a very daily basis in terms of our research processes, but actually acknowledging and writing about it is often very sparse. So I have a very pragmatic question for the three of you, and that is, have you also written about these ethical processes that you have had to go through? I mean, especially Mina, if you've spoken about perpetrators, there's a lot about re-traumatizing victims in terms of interviewing, but what about re-traumatizing perpetrators or other examples that you have of writing about your processes?
Okay, if we could hold that question, and I'll gather a few more. Yes.
Hello, my name is Thomas Unger. I'm working currently with the UN Special Rapporteur on Truth, Justice, Reparation, Care, this is non-reference, Pablo de Greif, who cannot be here today, but because he was invited as well, and he sends his best wishes. Pablo de Greif is also, I mean, he's the first kind of UN Special Rapporteur on Transitional Justice established by the Human Rights Council, so there is now, so to say, a number to call on this issue within the UN system, and this is obviously very interesting also for the research, because obviously these special rapporteurs can play in a way a catalyst also in translating in a way what's out there and bringing it to the political forum, to the Human Rights Council, but also to the General Assembly or elsewhere. So I think that's positive in a way, and like from the special rapporteur side, we would encourage you also to basically engage with us and invite us and include us in the discussions, and we're trying also to do this as much as possible, also not raising expectations, because probably it's a one-man show at the moment, maybe in the future one-woman show. So the thing is, he has no resources really. He is working full-time in another position, and so it's obviously this whole system of special rapporteurs has its limitations, but it still has its advantages, and at least we report twice a year to the UN, and it's an opportunity actually to translate research and kind of results of research into introducing it into policy debates. What I wanted to say actually is what I found interesting, what I got from the discussion, is this tension between this current approach or current reflection process within academic research on does transitional justice work or does it not work? So kind of a very critical approach to the field. But at the same time, we could see also that the years where transitional justice has developed, where it has basically been acknowledged by policymakers and acknowledged by policy documents, they are still there these years, and obviously NGO civil society has formed around this understanding around these principles, which often some NGOs says these are legal obligations. All four mechanisms of transitional justice have behind them clear legal obligations, and that's part of their advocacy. It's also part of policies governments have, because they say we signed up to certain treaties, we signed up to the Rome Statute, although the Rome Statute is debatable whether the ICC is a transitional justice tool or not, but still it kind of has this idea what to do after serious human rights violations. So states see it also as an obligation. So how do we actually, and I mean this kind of new discussion within academia is a healthy one, because it's basically really a reality check what's working from an independent, neutral point of view, you know. But then you have these legal obligations which also provide a certain structure. And when you speak with civil society on the ground, or with victims often on the ground, the only thing they want after serious crimes is to have a structure again. I mean, my wife is Lebanese, and I spend a lot of time in Beirut. If you speak basically to people there, the only wish they have is a certain structure. And the UN and human rights and this kind of transitional justice provides a certain structure. How limited this structure is. So do we, with this critical discussion of trying to now tear apart everything and doubt everything, do we actually contribute to basically building societies? That's a question I have myself. In addition, because the human rights movement, where transitional justice is seen to be embedded in, is a weak movement in comparison to, let's say, the security area or the development area. So anyway, human rights, if you look at it from a funding perspective, but also from a policy perspective, it's not that basically it's a major power. The major power is somewhere else. So how do we basically deal with this tension? Would be interesting to get a reflection from the panel on this.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I'm going to get two more, if that's all right, with the panelists at the back.
My name is Stefanie Heinrich. I'm a PhD student at the Irish Centre for Human Rights in Galway, and I work here for the Attorney General of Switzerland. And I was involved in the project in Leuven in 2004-2005. This is where my question also comes from. You mentioned this gap between what is promoted on the international level and what people actually feel on the ground, what their expectations are. I managed so far within my research to describe this discrepancy, but I cannot give anything at hand. How can we bridge this gap? What can we actually do? I would like maybe your thoughts on this. What can we recommend to civil society policymakers to deal with this gap and to address actually the issues people express on the ground?
My name is Miles Jackson from Oxford Transitional Justice Research. My question is whether you think there are any particular academic disciplines which might bring particular methodologies that are currently missing from the field that you might have found useful in drawing on in your own work.
Good, all right. Well, there's a lot there, so maybe I'll hand back to the panelists for some comments and reflections. Pierre, do you want to start?
Well, on the first question, you're totally right. I think it's a very important field, and and I'm not aware of much research about the epistemology or the way observers of transitional justice mechanism work, and myself haven't written about it, just about one case, the case I referred to, Rajak, because for me before that event, when the word truth was quite specific and was quite easy to understand, and suddenly I was confronted in a concrete case, and suddenly it became much more complex and complicated to describe what truth was about. And the second and third question, it's a very good questions, and I think we are all confronted to this tension. On the one hand, we do, I think personally, I think most of us would like these tools to be very successful. And what's happening very concretely is, I think politicians have to sell it to their own public opinion. So they have to market these tools, and they have to make a lot of promises, which are impossible to fulfill. But if they don't do that, these politicians won't be able to sell them to the public opinion. So they tend to promise much too much, and the expectations are impossible to be fulfilled. Nevertheless, how to bridge this gap is, I think, the NGOs and the people, the one who is doing the real work, has to lower the expectations, as it has been mentioned, and to fill that void between the so-called normative functions, restore dignity, deterrence, peace and security, and just to be very modest and humble about what is achievable. Because at the end of the day, as you just mentioned, it's the impact of these tools will depend a lot of the general situation and of other elements, the transformation of the society. And it's one element in the complex system of transformation of society. And it's an important element, but it's just one element. And this has to be framed, I think, correctly, and not to expect too much of these tools. That's the way I would see it. Regarding the last point about if there is any discipline or science which is missing in the field, my sense, I would reverse the question. I think there is one discipline which is too present in the fields, and it's the law. Because I'm sorry, I know that I'm not making many friends here. Armenian bodyguards, but the reality is that lawyers and politicians tend to see a lot of tend to describe a lot normative functions of these tools, and psychologists and philosophers so how complicated they are, and so for me it's important, so it participates to bridge the gap between the expectations and the reality.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I want to start by saying I totally agree with you. Well, for the first question, for about writing on ethical issues, this is actually a project my colleague and I have. We want to write an article on the position of the researcher because I think it's essential. There's been a lot of stuff written on how to deal as a researcher with victims and so on, but it's not so much about the individuals we don't want to identify with, basically. So that's the first point. So it's in our minds. Just looking for the time. For the second question about your basically your fear that it may have this critical stance may have a destabilizing effect on what is being done when structure is really needed. I think what I would say about that is we need to have a critical stance because each of these situations are different. Maybe not in terms of the conflict itself, but in terms of the way people respond to the consequences of the conflict. I'll give you a clear example that really strikes me. It's in Bosnia or Serbia? I think Bosnia. There's a few articles written about the need for silence, because we're always talking about truth, but some people in certain communities in Bosnia want silence, need not to express what they feel about the past, because they need to just basically go on with their everyday economic life. They need to be able to interact with people with whom they were in conflict, because they need their everyday life to continue. And this need, if you don't assess it, and you come and say, we need everybody to express himself and mutually acknowledge different truths, not working. It doesn't work there, but it may work in another context. So this is why I think this critical stance is important. What you were talking about in terms of structure, for me, is more related to development than transitional justice. I mean, I don't know what you would say about it, but it's my feeling that you need structure, economic, legal, material, and so on. But that doesn't mean you can't have a critical stance on these issues. So, as for the third question in terms of the gap, well, it's related to my response. I think it's important to look into local expectations, to look into local mechanisms to deal with the past, and to realize that if in one community, half of the people in that community are displaced persons from another region, it's not going to function in that community the way it's going to function 50 kilometers from there, talking about Bosnia. And this is something that we need to take into account, these micro realities, these micro differences. I mean, I don't know how to express it, but it's related to what you had seen with the Brocco district too. So, and for the fourth question, I definitely think that there's one discipline that needs more, that needs to be more present. It's starting. It's social psychology, because I mean, we've been working on intergroup conflict, at a very experimental level for a long time, but now there is research being done in a very concrete way. There's, as an example, one research that I really find quite interesting is in Israel and Palestine. There's this history textbook project, I don't know if you heard about it, where basically the idea is you instead of giving one version of the truth, you talk in these history textbooks about different versions of the truth, and you let kids basically make their own mind, develop a certain critical stance, and open up their perspectives to different narratives, which is very interesting. And then they saw the results in terms of acknowledging the past and moving forward and being less negative in terms of the conflict. So.
Right, good. And Roger, just a last few comments perhaps on the questions that you thought were most pressing from the floor.
Sure, just to follow up on your point, we're in plug one of my own research project. We're doing this project with in collaboration with UNICEF now on transitional justice in education, which I think there's been some work done in this area from the transitional justice perspective, but focusing very much on curriculum reform as a specific angle, and we're trying to consider this from a broader perspective in terms of how transitional justice processes and education reform and reconstruction can sort of feed into each other and influence each other. And I think the results of that would be really interesting. I mean, there's, education is one of those fields where you can see some sort of direct overlap in terms of, prosecution efforts or criminal trials, having outreach programs with students. But I think there's a lot of other ways in which there might be indirect influence between these areas. In terms of Thomas's question and this discussion about structures, and I do think that a lot of the structure that comes that is provided in transitional societies does come from development and other types of processes, and obviously the rule of law is there's an overlap between rule of law and development, and there's a lot of literature on that. I mean, our research on transitional justice and development, again, we tried to be very cautious and say, we don't think you should be putting expectations on transitional justice measures that they in themselves can rebuild the rule of society. But at the same time, there are real problems of rebuilding structures and doing development without considering the role that abuses had, the role that inequality had in creating abuses and conflict, and shaping the way that these structures are rebuilt. So I think transitional justice measures can have a modest influence on rebuilding those structures.
Great. And maybe just
Yes, what Roger said and Mina said, I want just to add one thing. I've been involved with a UN Special Rapporteur on cultural rights, which works closely with Pablo. And she just published 2 reports, one on textbooks in divided societies. And this report is available on internet. And in the next few days, there will be another report which will be also available on internet. It's memorialization in divided societies. And it has been extremely interesting to work with a special rapporteur, and it was a great experience. And I think they are very interesting reports. And the one on memorialization will be discussed at the next session of the Human Rights Council.
excellent. Good. Well, that just leaves us to thank our panelists and thank you for coming today.